I went to help my mom's friend move furniture, but when she said, "Now, move me," nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. The day had started like any other Saturday. I was at my mom's house, expecting the usual quiet morning and the faint smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. But today, she mentioned that her friend, Clara, would need help moving some furniture. I'd met her a few times before, always in passing, always with that effortless aura that made her stand out. I didn't expect that today would make me notice her in a way I hadn't before. When I arrived at her apartment, she was already there, standing next to a heavy armchair. She wore a simple blouse and jeans, but even in that casual outfit, there was a kind of quiet elegance about her. The sunlight streaming through the window caught the subtle highlights in her hair, giving her a warm, almost halo-like glow. She looked up at me and smiled, and for a moment, the world felt like it had slowed down. There was an ease in her expression, a mix of confidence and calm that made it feel natural to be near her. Yet underneath, I sensed something softer, a vulnerability that few people would notice. We started moving the furniture. The armchair was heavier than I expected, and I stumbled slightly as we lifted it together. Her hand brushed mine briefly as she adjusted her grip, and the contact sent a quiet jolt through me. Not the kind you'd call electricity, exactly, but a subtle awareness, a flutter in my chest, and the faint warmth of her skin against mine. I realized I was paying more attention to these small moments than I had any right to. As we navigated the living room, I noticed the little things, the way her fingers curved around the edge of the sofa, the careful way she stepped around the rug to avoid tripping, the soft sigh she let out when she leaned on the back of the chair. It was human, intimate, and strangely grounding. Even when she gave instructions, her voice was calm and measured, yet something in her tone hinted at humor just beneath the surface, like she was inviting me into a private joke that only she knew. I found myself watching how she moved, noting the contrast between her graceful motions and the casual, everyday tasks we were performing. There was a rhythm to it, the slight lean when she lifted, the careful placement of her feet, the way she would glance up at me to check I was keeping pace. Those glances weren't long, but they lingered just enough to make me self-conscious, aware of how close we were standing, how much I wanted to just keep looking. By the time we set the last piece of furniture in place, I realized my perception of Clara had shifted. She wasn't just my mom's friend. She was a person whose presence seemed to fill the room without trying. And in that shared effort, that quiet collaboration, I felt the first threads of connection forming. There was curiosity, yes, but also a sense of ease, of trust, even before a single deeply personal word had been spoken. And I knew, though I didn't fully understand why yet, that this day would leave a mark on me in a way I wasn't expecting. After we wrestled the last armchair into place, there was a brief pause where we both stood in the middle of the room, catching our breath. I could feel the heat rising to my face, partly from the exertion and partly from being this close to Clara. She leaned against the doorway, arms crossed casually, and smirked. "Not bad for a first-timer," she said, her tone teasing but warm. I laughed, brushing my hands on my jeans. I've had a lot of practice moving boxes for my mom. Furniture is a different league, I admitted. The corners of her lips lifted in a quiet chuckle, and I noticed the small crinkle by her eyes, subtle, but it made her look more approachable, more human. Then came the bookshelf. It was heavier than we expected, and maneuvering it down the hallway was like a delicate dance. We brushed against each other several times, shoulders and arms colliding softly. Each accidental touch felt magnified, her hand briefly grazing mine when she adjusted her grip, the warmth from her body seeping through her light sweater as we squeezed past each doorway. Every time our eyes met, even for a fraction of a second, there was a silent acknowledgement, a shared understanding that this wasn't just about moving furniture anymore. At one point, the bookshelf tilted precariously, and I reached instinctively to steady it. Her palm landed on my back as she leaned into the movement, and for a brief moment, I felt the steady pressure of her hand like an anchor. It wasn't intimate in an obvious way, but it was intimate enough that my heart rate picked up, and I had to remind myself to breathe. There was a rhythm to our movements, an unspoken coordination, and the closeness made the space between us feel charged without a word. She laughed softly when we finally set the shelf down. "You make a terrible heavy lifting partner, but a very effective one," she said. The corners of her mouth tilted up, and there was a teasing sparkle in her eyes. I felt my chest tighten in a way I didn't quite understand. It was admiration, excitement, and a strange sense of nervousness all rolled into one. We sat on the floor to catch our breath for a moment, leaning against the bookshelf. Our knees touched lightly, and she didn't move away. Instead, she tilted her head toward me, her gaze warm and attentive. I could see the subtle softness in her expression, the way her shoulders relaxed, and the small, almost imperceptible sigh she let out. There was a comfort here, a quiet intimacy that didn't need to be explained, just shared in proximity, laughter, and glances. Even as we teased each other about who was doing more of the work, I noticed how my awareness of her had sharpened. The light in her eyes when she laughed, the gentle brush of her hair from her face when she leaned forward. Every detail seemed magnified, charged with a quiet tension I couldn't name. It was playful, safe, and yet undeniably electric. Not the kind of electricity that shocks you, but the one that hums quietly, making every accidental touch and shared smile linger in your memory long after the moment has passed. By the time the last shelf was upright, I realized I had been watching her move, noticing every small motion, every subtle shift in expression, more than I had intended. And I felt it then, the first stirring of something I couldn't quite define, something that made the ordinary act of moving furniture feel like the beginning of a story I wanted to see unfold. We had just finished sliding the last piece of furniture into place, and for a few moments, the room was filled with the quiet hum of accomplishment, the soft scrape of fabric against hardwood, the faint creak of floorboards, and the distant chatter of traffic outside. I wiped the sweat from my brow and glanced at Clara, who was standing with her hands on her hips, surveying the room like a general inspecting a conquered battlefield. "You know," she said lightly, a mischievous glint in her eyes, "for someone so young, you move pretty well." I chuckled, brushing a stray strand of hair from my forehead, but before I could reply, she tilted her head, her gaze holding mine just a little too long, and added, "But now, move me." The words hung in the air like a spark in dry tinder. I froze for a fraction of a second, caught between laughter and disbelief. The tone was teasing, playful, but the way her eyes lingered on me made it impossible to ignore the underlying curiosity, maybe even a challenge. Her hand rested briefly on my arm as she emphasized the jest. The contact was light, casual on the surface, but underneath, I felt the warmth, the gentle pressure that seemed to echo in my chest. It was subtle, yet undeniable, and my pulse quickened almost imperceptibly. I realized I was hyper-aware of her proximity. The warmth of her shoulders so close to mine, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air, the soft weight of her gaze pressing on me like a quiet invitation. I laughed nervously, trying to defuse the tension, but even as I joked, my mind replayed the moment. The way her lips curved in that slight, knowing smile, the tilt of her head, the way her eyes flicked to mine and held me there. It wasn't just flirtation. It was a kind of silent acknowledgement, a bridge between two people who hadn't yet dared to speak the truth of their curiosity. For a moment, I caught myself imagining the softness of her touch, the steady warmth of her presence so close, the gentle brush of her fingers along my arm. My stomach tightened, my throat went dry, and I had to force myself to breathe normally. This was new territory, a quiet tension that didn't need words, but spoke volumes in the unspoken language of gestures, proximity, and subtle contact. Clara laughed lightly, breaking the moment but not entirely dissolving it. "I'm kidding," she said, but the faint curve of her lips, the way her hand lingered for a heartbeat longer than necessary, suggested otherwise. I realized that the joke was a way to test boundaries, mine, hers, and the invisible line between them. And in that instant, I understood that this day, a day that started with moving furniture, had transformed into something far more complicated. Something delicate, quietly electric, and entirely magnetic. I didn't know where it would go, but I knew one thing for certain. I would remember the way her gaze held mine, the way her hand felt on my arm, and the way a single sentence could make the ordinary feel charged with possibility. After the last of the furniture was set, we finally allowed ourselves a moment to pause. The apartment was quiet now, save for the gentle hum of a ceiling fan and the distant sounds of the city outside the window. Clara motioned toward the small kitchen nook. Tea? She asked softly, and I nodded. We settled on the couch with steaming mugs in hand. The warmth of the porcelain seeped into my palms, a comforting contrast to the subtle tension that still lingered between us. She sat with her legs tucked slightly to the side, shoulders relaxed, but there was a quiet intensity in the way she observed me, like she was studying not just my face, but the person I carried behind it. "Thanks for helping today," she said, her voice gentle. There was gratitude there, but also something deeper, something unsaid. Her fingers brushed mine as she adjusted her mug, and I felt the light pressure of her touch like a soft tether. It wasn't overwhelming or demanding. It was simply a reminder of the quiet presence we shared, a physical acknowledgement of connection. We began talking. At first, the usual small talk, but gradually, the conversation slipped into more personal territory. She spoke about the challenges of feeling unseen in a world that often overlooked her age, her experiences, and her quiet strengths. I listened, genuinely intrigued, noticing how her eyes glimmered with vulnerability when she mentioned moments of loneliness. I felt a surprising urge to confide in her, too. I shared the uncertainties of navigating life at my age, the insecurities, the pressure to figure everything out, the weight of expectations from family and friends. She listened with a patience I didn't expect, nodding gently, her fingers occasionally brushing the rim of her mug, a subtle rhythm that seemed to match the cadence of my words. There was a moment of silence between us, comfortable and unforced. I could feel her gaze resting on me, warm and steady, and I realized that in this quiet pause, we were sharing something rare, genuine, undistracted attention. The tension from before hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted from playful challenge to a softer, more intimate understanding. Her hand brushed against mine again, this time slightly longer as she shifted to reach for her tea. I felt a thrill at the contact, but it was a different kind of excitement now, quieter, grounded, like the calm before a storm or the steady pull of gravity drawing two bodies closer. Every subtle gesture mattered. The tilt of her head as she listened, the soft exhale that escaped her lips, the warmth radiating from her arm as she leaned slightly toward me. By the time we finished our tea, I felt a new kind of awareness, of her presence, of the unspoken connection, of the possibility that maybe, just maybe, this relationship could grow beyond simple attraction. It was no longer about flirtation or teasing remarks. It was about trust, understanding, and the tentative steps of emotional intimacy. I left that moment with a lingering sense of calm and a quiet anticipation. The world outside her apartment seemed brighter, the air heavier with possibility. In helping her move furniture, I had inadvertently moved into a space of emotional closeness, one that neither of us had expected, but both of us were beginning to understand. After leaving Clara's apartment, I walked back to my mom's house with a quiet restlessness that I couldn't shake. The day's work had been physically tiring, but it wasn't exhaustion that weighed on me now. It was something far more complicated, a tangle of curiosity, admiration, and a growing awareness of my own feelings I wasn't entirely prepared to name. Her words from earlier echoed in my mind, now moved me. Even though she had delivered it playfully, the way her gaze had held mine, the way her hand had lingered on my arm, made it impossible to dismiss. I couldn't stop replaying the touch of her skin against mine, the warmth of her proximity, or the subtle, steady cadence of her presence that seemed to ground me even as it stirred something I didn't fully understand. And yet, the hesitation came swiftly, almost like a counterweight to the excitement. She was older, more experienced, with a life shaped by responsibilities and history I had only begun to comprehend. The thought of the age difference gnawed at me, not in terms of attraction itself, but in the weight of perception. What would people think? Could I navigate the unspoken social boundaries without misstepping? The questions crowded my mind, each one heavier than the last, and for the first time that day, I felt unsure of myself. I found a quiet spot in the park near my mom's house and sat on a bench, letting the late afternoon sun filter through the trees. The breeze carried a faint scent of blossoms, but even the calm of the surroundings couldn't ease the storm in my chest. I thought about her laugh, the way her eyes had softened during our tea, the subtle brush of her hand on mine. There was an undeniable pull between us, yet it was tangled with hesitation, respect, and uncertainty. Part of me wanted to act on the connection immediately, to lean into the warmth, to explore the silent tension that had built so naturally between us. But another part of me held back, acutely aware that rushing would ruin something fragile and precious. There was a delicate balance at play, desire tempered by restraint, curiosity paired with thoughtfulness. I realized that attraction alone wasn't enough. What mattered was understanding, patience, and mutual consent, even if the emotional sparks were screaming for attention. I exhaled slowly, feeling the subtle ache of longing and restraint intertwined. It was frustrating in a way I hadn't anticipated. The urge to be near her, to touch her hand, to share a lingering glance, all tempered by the knowledge that this was a relationship I couldn't force. The age gap wasn't just a number. It was a landscape of experiences, expectations, and social perception that required careful navigation. As I stood to leave, the sun casting long shadows across the path, I made a quiet decision. I would let this connection develop naturally. I would pay attention to the subtleties, cherish the moments of proximity, and respect the emotional boundaries that were still forming. The tension between us wasn't something to resolve quickly. It was something to savor, to explore slowly, and to let guide the unfolding of a connection that already felt rare and meaningful. Even as I walked home, I felt a strange kind of excitement in the hesitation, a sense that the slow burn of this story, this unspoken attraction, would carry a depth far beyond anything I had anticipated. And for the first time, I understood that restraint could be just as thrilling as the moment itself. A few days later, I found myself back at Clara's apartment, though not for furniture this time. My mom had casually suggested I check in with her, and I had accepted, feeling a quiet pull I couldn't ignore. The moment I stepped through the door, I noticed the small ways the space reflected her personality, the neat stacks of books, the warm glow of sunlight against the wooden floor, the faint scent of lavender that lingered like a gentle signature. But more than the surroundings, it was Clara herself who anchored the room. She was seated at the kitchen table, her posture relaxed, a book open in front of her. When she looked up and saw me, her eyes softened, and a small, private smile curved her lips. The warmth of that smile made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't entirely explain. As I approached, our eyes met, and I noticed the way she studied me, not just casually, but with a steady, quiet attention that made me feel simultaneously exposed and seen. We sat together on the couch with steaming mugs of tea, the aroma mingling with the faint trace of her perfume. For a moment, we spoke about everyday things, the city, work, a recent film she'd enjoyed, but the conversation slowly gave way to a more intimate space. I found myself sharing thoughts I hadn't voiced aloud before, about the way life sometimes felt like a series of half-finished plans, fleeting moments, and unnoticed connections. Clara listened, as she always did, with that quiet patience that made me feel both safe and understood. And then, without warning, she reached out and lightly touched my cheek. Her thumb brushed along my skin in a deliberate yet tender motion, and for a heartbeat, time seemed to still. The warmth of her hand, the subtle pressure, and the softness of her touch sent a quiet thrill through me. It wasn't overwhelming, and it wasn't demanding. It was a gentle affirmation, a gesture full of meaning without needing words. I leaned slightly into her hand, aware of the faint heat radiating from her palm and the steady, comforting cadence of her presence. Her gaze held mine, unwavering yet soft, and in that shared silence, an unspoken understanding passed between us. There was curiosity, yes, but also respect, and an acknowledgement that something delicate and rare was growing between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I could hear the subtle rhythm of her breathing, feel the faint warmth of her cheek under her touch, and sense the quiet electricity of our connection. My mind raced, but my body remained still, savoring the intimacy of the moment, a slow, deliberate tension that was both thrilling and grounding. When she finally withdrew her hand, the space between us felt fuller, charged with possibility, yet anchored in quiet restraint. There was no rush, no declaration, just the profound recognition of connection, an understanding that we were both present, attentive, and willing to explore the slow-burning curiosity that had begun the day we moved furniture together. I left her apartment that evening with a lightness I hadn't expected, carrying the memory of her touch, her gaze, and the shared silence that had spoken volumes. The moment was fleeting, yes, but it marked the emotional peak of our slow-burn journey, a point where desire, respect, and vulnerability met, creating a foundation for something far deeper than I had imagined. The evening air was cool as I walked home from Clara's apartment, the city around me bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. I felt a strange combination of calm and anticipation, a sense that something important had shifted, even in the simplest of gestures, the brief contact, the lingering looks. The memory of her hand on my cheek replayed in my mind, the warmth and gentleness of it leaving a quiet imprint I couldn't shake. The next day, I found myself back at my mom's house, helping with chores and sipping tea, but my thoughts kept drifting to Clara. There was a subtle ache of longing mixed with contentment, a realization that connection could be quiet, unspoken, and still incredibly powerful. I caught myself replaying every glance, every brush of skin, every moment of laughter that had felt like a secret shared just between us. Later that afternoon, I received a text from her, casual in tone but unmistakably inviting. "Thanks again for yesterday. I enjoyed our quiet chaos with the furniture." I smiled, my thumb hovering over the keyboard as I typed a reply, feeling the warmth of anticipation in my chest. The conversation was light, filled with small jokes and friendly banter, but underneath it was a gentle thread of intimacy that neither of us tried to define yet. A few days later, I returned to her apartment. This time, there was no furniture to move, no tasks to accomplish, just the space between us, warm and inviting. She greeted me at the door, her smile soft but radiant, and we sat together in her living room. The sunlight spilled across the floor, casting a golden glow on her hair and the familiar, comforting features of her home. We spoke about life, plans, and quiet ambitions, our words flowing easily, but always with moments of stillness where neither of us felt the need to fill the silence. When she reached over and lightly touched my hand while laughing at something I said, it was no longer startling. It was expected, natural, comforting. The warmth of her skin, the gentle pressure of her palm, and the small, lingering glance made the room feel suspended in time. As the afternoon faded into evening, I realized that the tension we had felt in those first days of moving furniture had softened into something richer. It was no longer just curiosity or playful flirtation. It had grown into trust, mutual respect, and a shared understanding of each other's hearts. Every gesture, every touch, every glance had layered meaning, quiet, profound, and entirely ours. When it was time to leave, we stood at the doorway, the city outside humming softly. She waved, a small, graceful motion, and I stepped closer instinctively. Our hands met in a brief squeeze, gentle, deliberate, and full of unspoken promise. I could feel the warmth lingering even after we released, a quiet echo of connection that carried me home. Walking back, I smiled to myself. This story, which had begun with heavy lifting and playful banter, had unfolded into something far more tender. The age gap, the hesitation, the uncertainty, none of it mattered in the presence of the quiet intimacy we had built. The slow burn had blossomed into a steady warmth, and I knew that this was only the beginning. Even in the ordinary rhythm of life, I now carried the extraordinary, the memory of her touch, her gaze, and the shared moments that had transformed a simple day of moving furniture into the start of something unforgettable.